Something was wrong. Dan looked at his neighbor's garage. The door was open and trash cans were spilling onto the driveway. It wasn't Kyle's custom to leave doors open. Raccoons are such a pest in this area. He walked up and noticed a newspaper on the lawn. It was a little unusual. Kyle ran every day and always stopped for the newspaper. He also never left the front door open. Kyle was a technical designer in the theater and was always working on sound or lighting projects in his home studio. These projects often required silence or darkness, and for this reason, and because of the raccoons in the woods behind their backyard, he had trained himself to keep the house tightly closed unless he or Ginny were outside. Dan knocked on the frame of the open door and called inside to see if anyone was home. Just as he was about to shout to check if everything was okay, he saw Kyle lying on the floor in the doorway of his studio. By all indications, Kyle was beaten in his own home and left without help. Dan quickly dialed 911 on his cell phone, screaming for Ginny. He was able to hold back the adrenaline pumping through his veins long enough to give the 911 operator all the information he needed, then rushed from room to room to make sure she, too, wasn't beaten up somewhere in another room needing his help. She wasn't there. Dan had just finished examining the house when a police car with lights flashing pulled up to the house. The ambulance followed, and while paramedics tended to Kyle, police questioned Dan about what he had found. When Kyle was rushed to the hospital, there was one question on everyone's mind. Where was Ginny? Kyle and Ginny met in college. Both attended theater programs at drama schools in New York City, in the heart of one of the most active theater communities in the world. She studied acting, learning to create the illusion of history on stage. She was wonderful, but somehow she had a hard time accepting direction and preferred to give it. Her teachers noticed this and noticed how creative her ideas could be. They began preparing her for a career as a director or in theater management. Kyle was involved in the magic behind the scenes of the theater. He didn't have to create illusions like an actor. He created different realities through sound, light, effects, and his sets. He made the actors' work easy to understand for the audience. Kyle was immediately recognized as a genius. He was one of those rare talents who understood all aspects of technical theater and was as comfortable designing lighting as he was designing sound design. They met when they were both hired to work on a summer project in Connecticut the summer after their third year. Ginny had been brought there to direct scenes for her mentor and professor, who had just been hired to direct 2 of the company's 4 summer productions. Kyle had worked there as an electrician the previous 2 summers, but this year he became assistant lighting director and got the opportunity to design one of the shows. Working together, they immediately felt mutual attraction. This was their first, but not the last, production together as they built a career in this field. Ginny was slender, graceful, with a killer smile under deep brown eyes. She was exquisitely rounded where it mattered, without excess weight. Her long, tanned legs stuck out from the shorts she always wore, and her tops were conservative enough to say, "Please behave yourself," but revealing enough to say, "I might have a surprise." Kyle was strikingly handsome. He was a keen runner, claiming that his best ideas came during his morning runs, when his mind was cleared of the hustle and bustle of everyday life. He looked like he worked out regularly at the gym, although in fact he didn't need to. The daily lifting and climbing he did at work was a great substitute for the weight training his friends deemed necessary. He was slim and fit, and was fairly confident that if he continued to do the work of bringing his scripts to life, even while he was a designer himself, he would remain that way for the rest of his life. They spent 2 weeks yelling at each other from opposite corners of the theater, setting up lights, channeling special effects speakers, and announcing clues before finally sitting down together. They had to program clues into the light panel, and as they sat together, they became increasingly friendly. When they finished, Ginny leaned over and kissed Kyle on the cheek, telling him how much she enjoyed working with him and that he made her job something she looked forward to every day. Kyle kissed her back, but not on the cheek. She reciprocated, and their little tete-a-tete in the control booth got pretty hot. The door to the theater below opened and slammed shut as the director walked in and called out to them. Kyle, Ginny, are you done yet? We need to close the building. They quickly cleaned themselves up and went down from the booth. It's ready and you'll love it, Ginny replied, walking down the stairs ahead of Kyle, trying to hide their little affair. They began to look for opportunities to be together, but as work on the production began, time became less and less. Ginny traveled every day with a professor from her apartment in the city, while Kyle lived at home, a short drive in the other direction. One evening, Professor Ginny did not come to the show, staying in town to celebrate his daughter's birthday. Ginny was supposed to be in charge, but she had no place to stay. Kyle suggested a guest room in his home. Ginny was delighted. She really didn't need much space. One bed would be enough. It was late when they arrived at his house. Ginny had fallen asleep in the car, and he didn't want to annoy her by being so tired. After all, she became very special to him. He didn't feel the same way about her as he did about the shallow girls he dated at college parties or after theater shows. So when they arrived home, he was the perfect gentleman, the perfect host. He took her to her room, at least the one he intended to have her in, and made sure she was settled. He then retired to his room for a well-deserved rest. Tomorrow there will be time to talk. He was vaguely aware of the door to his room opening and someone joining him in bed. Soft, graceful arms wrapped around him, and the sweetest kiss he had ever experienced was gently placed on his lips. He felt the warmth of her body pressing against his. He turned and kissed her passionately. Kyle, Kyle, called Dr. Kenton, he's coming. Kyle. His vision flickered and was illuminated by the bright fluorescent lights in the operating room. It was hard to focus, and he was very confused. His vision only worked in one eye. He tried to get up, but was chained down, and immediately began to struggle against the restraints. Easy, Kyle. You were in serious condition, but we will help you. Don't resist. We're on your side. He relaxed in bed and looked at the nurse who was talking to him. Dr. Kenton will be here shortly and will explain everything. What happened to my eye? Kyle became alarmed when he realized his eye was heavily bandaged. He was seriously injured, but I need to wait for the doctor to tell you everything. Stay calm, he will be here soon. And indeed, the doctor came very soon. He examined Kyle, explaining his injuries. Kyle was beaten. An optical surgeon repaired the detached retina, but also had to repair skull fractures around the eye socket. He suffered a pretty serious concussion from the impact that caused these injuries, and everyone was very happy to see that he still had control of his speech. Kyle's arm was severely broken and placed in a cast. If his neighbor had found him an hour later, he would not have survived. He had been unconscious for 2 days since his discovery, and they were still trying to determine the time of the attack to estimate how long he had lain unaided. I don't remember the attack. The doctor frowned and began asking Kyle questions. When he realized that Kyle couldn't remember any circumstances leading up to the weekend or Friday before him, he started asking general questions. When he finished, Dr. Kenton knew that Kyle couldn't remember anything that happened from his freshman year until he met Ginny. The attack left Kyle with severe memory loss, and only time will tell how soon it may return. Detective Porter, who was assigned to investigate Kyle's case, was visibly upset. His line of investigation into the incidents leading up to the attack reached a dead end last Friday when Kyle disabled the home alarm. Where has Ginny been all this time? Kyle saw Ginny regularly, and their love grew every day. Both of their careers were already established by the end of the year, with Kyle regularly working as a designer at several small suburban theaters, and often backstage downtown for established designers. Ginny got a job backstage at one of the major opera companies located in Lincoln Center, a stable job with great benefits that she could keep for life. They rented a small apartment near her theater and enjoyed the city's vibrant performing arts scene. He remembered the tender moments they shared. She was a skilled decorator and master shopper, and decorated their apartment so exquisitely that it became a popular meeting place for their friends. He was a gourmet cook, and whether it was a dinner for the two of them and company, or just a candlelit dinner for the two of them, he always made her eyes roll back in delight at his delicious food. Kyle woke up in a cold sweat, still in his hospital bed. How Ginny fit into his life now. He was told about his amnesia and how slowly it could return. He was told that he would have periodic episodes during which he would almost relive his life as the oldest lost memories would return first. He wasn't prepared for how vivid the dreams were or how much the thoughts of making love bothered him. Earlier that day, Kyle could only think of Ginny as the girl he knew from summer theater camp, and now memories of their time together came flooding back. He yearned to remember how she fit into his life throughout all these years that his concussion had stolen from him. Where was Ginny now? Memories of their early life gradually returned to his mind over the following days. Her rise through the ranks led to her taking a full-time position as stage manager at a very active suburban theater that staged plays and concerts. It was a theater that often invited Kyle to work, and the couple was financially secure. They decided to get married. Now he could remember the wedding. The details revealed a ceremony in a small church. He heard the soft play of the organ playing Bach and smelled the distinct beeswax scent of the candles burning at the altar as his eyes filled with tears at the delightful sight of his bride walking toward him with a smile. He could taste the fine dining at the small Greek restaurant where they had their wedding feast. They danced and then hugged their family and friends as they headed to the small hotel room where they spent their wedding night. It was perfect. The room was lit by the fire in the brick fireplace at the foot of their bed. They stood next to the flickering flames and kissed. They swayed to the beat of music that wasn't there. Gently, he unbuttoned her satin dress. As elegant as she looked in it, the light from the fire made her naked body even more beautiful. She slowly walked up to Kyle and hugged him. He responded with passionate kisses and laid her body on the bed. They made love slowly that night, taking time to get to know every inch of each other's body. They kissed every part of each other's body, and when they were done, they spent hours looking into each other's faces, dreaming of a long life together, growing old together. They woke up in the morning the same way they fell asleep, face to face, looking at each other. Finally, she pressed herself against him, and he felt her leg wrap around his thigh. Once again, Kyle woke up in a cold sweat in his hospital bed. He still couldn't stay awake for long, but he always woke up alarmed when his dreams included sex with Ginny. Why did he always wake up so scared? Was he still married to Ginny? If so, where was she? He asked the nurse to tell him what they knew about him. "I can't do it," she replied. "I don't know enough about you to fill in the blanks. I can help you recover your memories, but if I suggest something wrong, it could cause worse problems. Unfortunately, your concussion and the condition of your eye require us to keep you calm and quiet. Stress is not an option now, my friend." Dr. Kenton stopped by for his evening rounds. He was glad to see that Kyle remembered events leading up to his wedding, but there was still a gap of 15 years. He agreed to give Kyle some information, as long as Kyle accepted it calmly. "You are still married to Ginny, according to the neighbor who found you and saved your life. You still work as a freelance theater designer and are quite successful. You have a wonderful house not far from this hospital. You and your wife have no children, but otherwise you are a typical happy couple living the American dream." The doctor continued to explain the severity of Kyle's injuries again, now that Kyle seemed more awake and alert. They were all confident that he would make a full recovery from all his injuries. He went into medical detail about each injury, and Kyle listened, but didn't hear the answer to the question he wanted to ask, but could only think about one thing: where is Ginny? Ginny sat back on the dock by the lake. The water cooled the fingers of the hand hanging over the edge. The clouds drifted slowly over the mountains that rose steeply on both sides of the lake. She was in another world, far from the bustle of the city, far from the constant demands of the quarrelsome actors and prima donna musicians who came to perform on her stage. She was also far from Kyle. She wasn't sure what to think about this. She was sure she still loved Kyle, but he was such a workaholic. He could never find time to leave, and his schedule was so rigid that she just didn't feel like their time together was a priority. This little vacation with Steve was just what she needed. What could Kyle do to her anyway? Divorce her? Oh, okay. She looked at Steve. He stood on the shore, his back to her, lifting dumbbells in the sun, finishing his morning workout. Muscles bulged up and down his back, his huge arms glistening with sweat. Steve was a college football star and played several seasons in the NFL before suffering a knee injury. Steve now ran a chain of local gyms and kept his body in that ripped, lean state. He was smart with money and hired a manager who invested his NFL earnings in real estate. Who cared if he was stupid about everything except money? He couldn't hold a conversation about anything other than football and bodybuilding. But when he held her close to him, it was like being in a cheap novel. She fainted as he picked her up and carried her to the bed. "Okay, Kyle," she mused, "get a divorce. We don't have any kids to hurt, and look who I end up with. I'll marry Mr. Universe. That'll make me Mrs. Universe. I'll trade the dusty theater for the gym, where I can train whenever I want, or just sit and admire bodybuilders in lycra tights all day if I want." She was looking forward to his call. After Kyle ran into them at the house as they were leaving last Friday, she half expected a bailiff to come out to her with divorce papers. She picked up her cell phone for the 100th time today, just to make sure it was working and ready for his call. The battery is charged. The signal is full, thanks to a convenient cell tower she spotted at the top of the hill. The ringer was on loud, but there were no calls from Kyle. They hadn't called her from work since she'd arranged this vacation week months before. Not a single call from Kyle, a week after he begged her not to leave with Steve. How can you ask for attention for 1 minute and then not call for a week? But now it's Friday and still no sound. She sat down on the pier. Her naked body sparkled after a week of tanning every day and visiting different wineries and taverns every night. She liked the Finger Lakes. The evening sun beautifully illuminated everything around. Why did Kyle always insist on holidaying at a cottage on the Cape? There were no crowds, no beaches for teenagers, just the quiet solitude of the forests. Kyle again. She couldn't get rid of thoughts about him. Why didn't he call? It was so strange. She got up and called her home number. The answering machine answered. It was annoying to hear a recording of my own voice in response. She left a message in Kyle's inbox saying she'd be home early Sunday so they could talk. When she hung up, she sat thoughtfully, holding the phone in her hand. Perhaps there will be no divorce. Maybe Kyle will give in and ask her to come home. Yes, he will behave better from now on. Cook, clean, and keep her in style worthy of a goddess. Oh yes, he will fulfill her every whim while she runs off to enjoy the magnificent body of her lover Steve. It was amazing to dream. Kyle should have been home. If he was angry, why didn't he call? And if he wasn't angry, how did he feel? She knew he didn't have a show this weekend. He wasn't home. He didn't call in a week. He didn't even send an SMS. It was very strange. He was denying her the opportunity to have the argument she had been playing out in her mind since she left. She wanted this quarrel. She wanted to see his passion, and he didn't even give her that. She called home again, and this time she entered the code for her personal message box instead of the general family one. It was full. There were worrying calls from neighbors, from Kyle's mom, and most alarmingly, several from Detective Porter. It looks like Kyle was badly injured. It appears his injury has attracted the attention of the police. Oh God. Her mind raced, but eventually settled on the last time she saw Kyle. Kyle was on his knees, begging her not to leave. He held onto her bag, saying that nothing could be so bad that she would leave like that without telling him anything. She expected a more dignified reaction and saw this manifestation as beneath his dignity. Honestly, I don't know how you can expect me to respect you as a man. Stand up and face the facts. You don't treat me like I'm important. Steve does. You raise the light high on the pipe. Steve lifts me into bed with such strong arms that I lose my breath. You complain that I don't make love to you passionately anymore, so you have nothing to lose at all. I need a vacation. I need a vacation away from the Cape. I need to know how another man can make me feel, how it feels to be idolized. She looked at him with contempt as he stepped back. Steve stood giggling quietly in the doorway. This made her smile. Be a man. Let me go. If he doesn't live up to expectations, I'll come back next week and we can talk. Kyle let go of the suitcase. If you leave, everything will change. There will be no turning back. What makes you think where we were is so special? She grabbed her bag and walked out the door. I'll be right there, Steve said. I just have something I have to say to that little coward. As Ginny headed to the car, Steve approached a dejected Kyle who was still kneeling in the hallway. Steve's massive hand sent its fist towards the back of Kyle's head. He left without closing the door, got into the car with Ginny, and headed north towards the lake. Ginny smiled throughout the entire trip. She remembered meeting Steve last winter. Kyle always stayed so slim and fit thanks to his running and high physical activity at work. She had, however, gained some weight, and although she was not fat, she looked much older than her husband of the same age. She joined Steve's gym and hired him as her trainer. She still remembered the first time he touched her in the jacuzzi, when they were alone there. She was so flattered by his attention that she allowed Steve to take her upstairs to his apartment. This was something completely different from what she had experienced with Kyle. Kyle was on a business trip to oversee the tour of his latest show in Chicago and was gone for a week. Ginny woke up from her nap, worried. She was worried about Kyle because she still loved him. She was also bothered by a threatening message from Detective Porter asking her to contact him about Kyle's beating. He hadn't called to report an attack. It sounded more like something she should have already known about. She saw the bulky figure of Steve finishing his form on the crossbar of a low-hanging branch. Steve, what did you mean when you said everything was settled? He was defeated? She asked. Steve looked at her. What do you mean? Last Friday, at my house, as we were leaving, and you followed me out of the house. You said, it's all settled. He's defeated. What did you mean? Oh, just marking his new territory. I had to let him know who's boss now. There's only one leading male in every pack, baby, and I'm going to make sure it's me. Steve, what did you do? I hit him in the nose, beat him up a little. It wasn't very serious. Steve, the police left a message on my answering machine. Kyle was badly injured. Not by me, baby, Steve lied. He was conscious and moaning when I left. Maybe he got drunk after that and fell, or someone broke in and beat him up after we left. We need to go back. No way, he replied. We have 2 more days of sun and booze, and 2 nights of sex. Steve, this is serious. Kyle was badly injured, and the police will suspect that I was out of place and did not communicate. It will look bad if you hit him. He ended up beaten, and we didn't come back. You want to trade 2 nights of sex for 2 years in prison. She rushed into the house to pack both bags. When she came out, Steve had already packed his most important personal items, including dumbbells, into the trunk of his car. Okay, maybe that makes sense, he said. Went. They threw their bags back, locked the house, and rushed south. On Friday morning, Kyle's eye patch was removed. His biological clock was finally freed from the effects of trauma and anesthesia. He was cheerful and flirted with the nurses. Repeated police interviews had so far yielded no results, which irritated Detective Porter. Kyle was happy to remember his pleasant home life with Ginny, his work on the show until about a year ago. He also recalled some major projects in his studio. There was something to do with his recording equipment, something about sound effects. This haunted him, but he could not clearly imagine what it meant. He slept peacefully on Friday night, knowing that he could return home on Saturday. As Kyle fell asleep, Ginny arrived home to a dark house. Steve brought her bag for her, and both were stunned to see a notice on the door stating that this was a crime scene, but the processing had been completed and the occupants could return. She looked at Steve. Just a punch to the nose, huh? Steve turned pale. He may have gone overboard in his anger, and if he left Kyle in critical condition without help, he could be charged with something more serious than simple assault. His mind searched for an explanation. It was not his mind that was a finely tuned machine. "We can't tell the police that I hit him," Steve said. "We should say that I left first, carrying your bag to the car, and that he was fine when you left." "This is bad, Steve. This is very bad." "Ginny, stick to the plan and we'll be fine. We'll look like scum for leaving and not being here for him, but they won't be able to pin it on us." "On us?" Ginny was perplexed. "I was in the car. Anything that sticks will stick to your pathetic skin, not mine. Separation from Kyle, even divorce, is one thing. Going to prison for beating him is a completely different matter. You were with me, baby, and you heard me say he was defeated. You're in this with me. I may not be the smartest guy on the block, but I know what it's like to be an accomplice." She thought about it and realized that Steve was right. She couldn't explain their sudden departure unless she said they left Kyle in good condition, leaving open the possibility that someone else had come in and beaten him up. How did she even get into this situation? She agreed with Steve, and they solidified their story. By the time they decided what to say, it was almost midnight. She called Detective Porter, and he told them he would meet them at the police station immediately. This was an urgent matter, and it could not wait until morning. Ginny wanted to go to the hospital first, but Detective Porter insisted. He said Kyle is medically out of danger and is likely resting. He pointed out that she took her time to see Kyle when he was in critical condition, and even tonight she went home rather than directly to the hospital. There was no reason to bother him. He needed the rest he needed to recover. There were questions that needed to be answered. Ginny didn't answer until the detective suggested that the patrolman give her and Steve a ride. They got into the car and drove to the station. They were questioned separately, but both stuck to their stories. They didn't provide much information, relying mostly on, "I don't know." They admitted that they were in the house and saw Kyle. It was accepted that he was very upset when they left, but he was physically unharmed. Porter didn't believe them, but he had no evidence to support his suspicions. He knew that Kyle would be released from the hospital today, so he decided to keep the two confined until Kyle was settled at home and until Porter alerted him that his wife was coming home. It could also give Steve and Ginny the opportunity to believe that the other had given in and told the truth, perhaps causing them to speak more freely. Porter was waiting for Kyle's neighbor Dan to bring him home. Kyle walked out carefully, still very sore from the brutal attack. He beckoned Porter into the house. Dan's wife, Kim, had come earlier and cleaned the hallway. The house was beautiful and welcoming, and there was something delicious smelling in the kitchen. She smiled as she walked out of the kitchen and invited everyone to the table for a home-cooked homecoming dinner. Although Kyle appreciated Kim's efforts, especially cleaning up reminders of the incident, he felt uncomfortable being at home. He could now remember the events that had happened last week, right up to the day of the incident, and the absence of those last parts irritated him. Kim and Dan cleaned up the kitchen and said goodbye. They coordinated with other neighbors to visit him every couple of hours to make sure he was okay, at least on the weekends. They made sure he knew that if he needed anything, he should call immediately. After they left, Detective Porter looked at Kyle and said, "She'll be home soon, you know." "I know. She was already here." Kyle nodded towards Ginny's bag by the door. "I delayed them today to make sure you were tuned in and ready to meet her. He'll probably be with her." "I'm ready." Detective Porter noticed the determination in Kyle's voice and the determination in his eyes. "I want to show you something." Kyle led Porter into his studio. Porter was impressed by the array of audio equipment, digital devices, and computer technology in the room. Kyle led him to a workstation connected to a large mixing console. This is my main audio recording setup. There are many interesting files here. Some of them I forgot until this minute. For the last couple of days, I've been plagued by the memory of a project I was working on, but couldn't remember. When Dan and Kim left, it reminded me of another couple who left the house last Friday, right before I was attacked. Perhaps I was recording something when they arrived and forgot to turn off the recording. I may have an audio file that could explain a lot to you if something happens to me. I may have recorded everything from the moment Ginny and Steve left here until the recording reached my preset limit of 12 hours. I should take this back to our lab. I would prefer it if you didn't do this. I would love it if you would let me fight your battles. Detective Porter looked at Kyle. He wasn't suspicious. He didn't have to, because he knew Kyle's intentions were to return the gift Steve had generously given him last week. Kyle, I love watching a good no-holds-barred fight. Unfortunately, I will have to arrest the participants and witnesses. I also love seeing the underdog come back strongly and take back what he lost. Steve is a big guy and trains a lot in that gym. It does not matter. Hey, what I don't know doesn't hurt me. Just give yourself time to heal a little more. Kyle nodded. Detective Porter wished him well and made sure Kyle added his phone number to his cell phone's speed dial list. Steve brought Ginny home from county detention that evening. Her hair was tousled and her clothes were rumpled. They both walked into the house, but Steve stopped at the door as she walked alone into the living room. "Hi," she said quietly. Kyle just looked at her, no expression on his face. "I heard you were hurt, so I came back early." Internally, he exploded. He wanted, in the worst way, to jump out of his chair and reprimand her for her false concern, for returning 2 whole days early from a trip that should not have been taken in the first place, to arrange an affair that he could not understand and disapprove of. But on the outside, he showed nothing but calm. Right. She was surprised by his lack of emotion. After his scene of him begging to stay, full of tears and hugging the bag, she expected more. "Are you okay now?" "They come alive." "We need to talk." "No, no need. We talked last week." "Kyle, we can't just let this fester in our minds. You need to discuss this with me. I need to know what to expect. Expect separation, then divorce. Expect to leave me and not return. Expect me to treat you with respect like any other person, but without the love and care that I had for you a week ago." Some of it was as she expected, but she didn't expect him to be so calm and collected. So she'll stay for a couple of days, and then pack her things and leave once she's organized her affairs. She set her bag down and turned to sit down. "I said you were leaving." She turned to him with a questioning look. "I mean now. Go. I don't think you understand what's going on. I might have hurt you, and I might have ended our marriage, but I didn't give up rights to my house or things. I'll move into the guest room, but I'm staying here until I'll pack my things and not move." Before she could continue her tirade, Kyle pressed the remote in his hand. The home stereo he had installed turned on and played a recording of last Friday's events. She can clearly be heard sarcastically belittling him, saying that she was going on vacation with a real man and he couldn't stop her. Steve can be heard laughing as she tells Kyle what she plans to do with Steve for the entire week, or even longer. Kyle can be heard begging her to stay and trying to smooth things over, crying piteously as he tries to hold on to her bag. Her heels clicked loudly on the floor as she walked away, and Steve said, "Good luck, baby." After the door slams shut, it can be heard opening again. Ginny shouts in the distance, "Let's go, Steve," he answers her, and he can then be clearly heard telling Kyle, "Don't let you have any thoughts of following us or trying to stop us." This is followed by terrifying sounds. On the way out, Steve delivers the final blow. "Now your head is as broken as your pathetic heart. Just lie here and think for an hour or two. You will understand that she needs a big male to make her happy. But she will come back to you when she realizes that a large male cannot stay with one female for long." Kyle looked at the startled Ginny. Steve appeared in the doorway, frowning at Kyle. "Why, you little treacherous coward?" Kyle stopped him by holding up one finger. "Porter has no record, but he'll have it if I want it. I don't want him to send you to jail. I want revenge." Ginny was horrified. Steve grinned from ear to ear. "I'm offering a bet. Both must agree and your terms are different, or there is no deal and Porter will receive the audio file in 10 minutes via email. In 6 weeks from today, as soon as the cast is removed from my arm and my ribs are healed." "You're not going to win," Steve shook his head as he spoke. "No, I couldn't win after that cheap shot last week. This time we fight honestly, without sneaking up behind you to stab an unsuspecting victim. Coward. You will see me coming, and you will not be able to stop me, just like I could not stop you lying unconscious last week. Are you sure you can win under these conditions? Unarmed, man against man? I'll tear you apart. Put in your own gyms." Steve looked at him again. He wasn't willing to risk something that big. He owned the gym, and the building it was in outright. The building contained several offices that were profitable and were a real cash cow. His apartment occupied the top floor of the building and was a luxurious space overlooking Long Island. But Steve didn't believe that this guy could be his rival. Of course, David defeated Goliath, but David had a sling. "Put all your gyms in." Steve thought about his expanding business. Not only did he have a flagship club, but he also had 6 branches around the city, and they were so successful that he was considering selling franchises. "What, you bet all this against your house and all these cool electronics? Are you crazy?" "No, my house and electronics are not at stake. You are betting against this recording and all its copies. You bet your businesses, your real estate." Silence fell over the room as Steve realized that he would fight for his freedom. "And your cars." Steve has owned several vintage and new Corvettes, one from each decade since the 50s. They were his pride and joy, and the whole town knew it. This made the stakes incredibly high, but Steve thought that Kyle would be no match for a physically trained bodybuilder. Of course, David defeated Goliath, but David had a sling. "All right, enough. And a dacha on the lake." Okay, you hold all the cards, don't you? I'll risk everything. But there's really no risk, I'll break you." Kyle looked at Ginny. She had listened to him list the bets to Steve and was now preparing to hear what her risk would be. "If I win, I want everything and I want you to leave. Without contesting the divorce, without taking anything from this house or our cottage, and not a dime from our bank account or investments. You will need to watch every minute of the fight. You will also have to live with Steve before the fight, and if I win, for a full year after." Ginny trembled, but nodded in agreement. She knew how strong Steve was, but she also knew how fit Kyle was, how much training he did, how well he knew his body, and what he could do with it. She didn't know who would win, but she knew she would have to live with the winner. Steve reviewed the terms one last time, nodded, and, looking back at Ginny, left the room. He knew he had 6 weeks to prepare and that he had everything he needed to win: strength, size, gym, and, in his opinion, enough dominance. He couldn't imagine losing, so his thoughts were focused on how he would manage Kyle's empire after victory. Kyle was alone at that moment. He was unsure of his recovery from such an injury. He did not know if he would be able to return to the physical shape he had before the attack. But he knew one thing: he had to win, not only to save his home and property, but also to regain his dignity and control over his life. Winning this fight was for him much more than just material gain. It was the restoration of his humanity, which he felt he had lost after Ginny's betrayal and Steve's cruelty. He started with rehabilitation, then gradually returned to training. Every day he felt his body becoming stronger and his mind becoming more determined. He knew Steve had the advantage in size and strength, but Kyle relied on his stamina, speed, and strategy. His plan wasn't to beat Steve in a power match, but to tire him out, use his size against him, and find the perfect moment to land the blow that would end the fight. In the run-up to the day of the fight, tension grew. Kyle spent the last night before the fight reviewing everything he knew about wrestling, about Steve, about how people react under pressure. He knew that the next day would change his life forever, no matter the outcome. The day of the battle has arrived. Kyle came to the gym where the fight was supposed to take place. He was wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants when he walked in, surrounded by silence and anticipation. Steve was already there, wearing loud boxing shorts and a t-shirt with his gym's logo on it. Ginny sat at the table with a thoughtful look, holding the envelope that contained Steve's property rights and contracts, his bets. Steve was surrounded by his friends, all from his gym, his employees and clients. They encouraged him, mocking and teasing him about how easily he was going to deal with Kyle. They teased even more when Kyle entered the room. His lean runner's body seemed incomparable to Steve's muscular bulk. Kyle walked past Ginny and tossed his briefcase, containing his contracts and recording, onto the table next to Steve's things. When he climbed into the ring, he said, "Let's go. No bells, no referee. We don't stop until one of us is down." Steve grinned and walked over to the ropes, climbed into the ring, and extended his hand to Kyle. Kyle looked at her and, not accepting her, punched Steve in the nose. Steve stumbled back, stunned. "No bells," Kyle said as he hit Steve again. Steve's impressive bulk made him look great, but he wasn't as flexible as Kyle. His rigid frame slowed his reactions, and he moved poorly compared to Kyle's easy dodges and maneuvers. Steve was having a hard time catching up with Kyle, but he just couldn't get his big body to react quickly enough to pin his opponent. Every time he got close enough to hit Kyle, Kyle made him pay with a series of punches to the face. It didn't take long before Steve's face swelled, and he slowed his efforts to corner Kyle. Steve soon realized that he was no better in the center of the ring. Kyle might not look impressive, but he was also a short man and had a significant advantage in arm length. He didn't slow down either, while Steve grew tired of the many powerful blows, the best of which barely touched their target. As Steve grew tired, Kyle began attacking his body. It didn't take long until Steve's arms became heavy and dropped. Kyle took it apart piece by piece. "Give up, Steve. You can barely stand. You can't defend yourself. You lost," Kyle said. Steve looked up at him, breathing heavily. Both of his eyes were swollen shut and blood was oozing from his nose, running from a nasty cut under the one eye he could still see. "Surrender now, and I will leave you more than you deserve. Apologize to everyone here. Do it now, and I'll only take this room, this building, and the 58 convertible. You keep the rest. If you don't give in now, I'll knock you out and take everything." Steve knew he had lost. His head had already dropped as his body fell to his knees. "I'm sorry," he said. Kyle walked over to the desk and pulled out the paperwork for the building, the hall, and the title to the 58 vet. Keys in hand, he turned to the unbelieving crowd of Steve's friends and acquaintances. "I'm closing the theater and opening a theater school here. I will honor the employment contracts you had with Steve, but I expect you to work for me in a useful role. If he transfers you to one of his other halls, I will release you from your obligations here. For those of you who rent space in this building, I will honor your leases and will be fair in negotiations when they end. However, the atmosphere here will change as this hall will be converted into a theater. If you want to terminate your lease because of this change, I will release you." Ginny looked at Kyle in confusion. They had long shared the dream of creating a community of theater professionals and amateurs dedicated to the development of the performing arts. Now he was pursuing their dream without her, with the resources to do it thanks to her betrayal. She felt completely excluded and suddenly very lonely and lost. The color drained from her face as she looked at the beaten Steve. He had never looked so pathetic, so broken. Kyle has never looked so bold. There was no triumph or arrogance in his manner, only the calm confidence with which he did everything. 6 months later, Ginny is still living in Kyle's guest house. They rarely communicate, although they continue to work together. She is one of his most valuable employees, serving as stage manager, director, and teacher at his theater center. She sees Kyle as her best friend and respected boss. Her play, which she wrote, was a success in regional theaters and was published by a major publishing house. She is financially independent and begins to seem like the same Ginny she was before. Kyle's acceptance of Ginny back into his life was taken by neighbors, family, and the theater community as a signal that she was worth being welcomed back into those circles with much the same status she had many months ago, although no one had forgotten where she was. Steve sold his businesses and, after a period of reflection, realized that he didn't like the person he was. He finally put the physical education degree he earned in college to use by taking a job at a local elementary school. He developed a weakness for working with children with physical disabilities and other disabilities. He became a Special Olympics coach and volunteer in the physical therapy department of a local children's hospital. Kyle's theater project flourished, and its programs were accredited by the local university. His programs for schoolchildren were highly regarded and proved very profitable. His professional productions sold out theaters and attracted the attention of leading New York critics who usually do not stray far from Broadway theaters. Kyle and Ginny lived near each other, but rarely spoke. Although he cared for her when she needed it, he did so out of his sense of responsibility. She was the love of his life, and he couldn't stand to see her in utter ruin, beaten and rejected by the community that ruled the profession she lived in. Once he had her secure, he wanted nothing more from her. He treated her professionally because she was good at her job and was a huge asset to his company. However, he could not see her in a different light and rarely even spoke to her on the level of a friend. Ginny accepted her position in Kyle's life as a blessing. She wasn't in jail, she was working, and had the opportunity to make up for her mistakes with Kyle at least to some extent. She felt that living next to him with no chance of him loving her again was better than the alternative. There was no way to fully atone for her guilt to him. But perhaps if she stayed here until she saw him happily settled with a new love, and perhaps a family, she could find peace. The moment inevitably came when Kyle fell in love with a divorced woman he met on the Cape. She spent the summers in a nearby cottage with her brother's family and young daughter. She moved in with Kyle in the fall, and they married in October in a beautiful but intimate ceremony in Kyle's backyard. Ginny declined an invitation to attend the event, but watched from her bedroom window, the only one with a view of the event. She cried bitter tears remembering the events that had led her to this moment, and now the final chapter was complete. Her tears fell on the last small suitcase. She had already loaded the rest into the rental car parked outside the garage. As the guests moved into Kyle's house for dinner, Ginny grabbed her bag and got into the car. She took one last look at Kyle's house before driving away. She knew he would find the farewell letter she left on his desk when she returned from her honeymoon. She checked her hand luggage again to make sure she had her ticket and passport, as well as a signed contract for a new job as a stage director in London. Kyle now had a new life. She shed her last tear and left in search of her own.